Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Constitution Center. My name is Madison, and I'm a member of the center's education team. And I'm so excited to welcome you to Live from the Museum. We're going to be taking a look today at African Americans in the fight for abolition. As you can see, I am not live at the museum, but my wonderful colleague Aria is, and she's going to be taking us through our incredible exhibit, Civil War and Reconstruction, the Battle for Freedom and Equality. Now, these are going to be the guiding questions that kind of drive our time together today. Number one, how was slavery embedded into the Constitution? We're going to take a look at that. And we're also going to explore some of the key African-American figures in the abolition movement. And then finally, we'll end with the Reconstruction Amendments and really looking at how those 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments transform the Constitution. So we have a lot to do and a lot to see. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Aria. Aria, please take us away on this amazing virtual tour.
All right, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Aria. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for coming to see what we have here at the National Constitution Center. Again, my name is Aria, and I'll be showing you our Civil War and Reconstruction exhibit. So basically this exhibit here, which details, of course, the Civil War, but it does start in 1787. So talking about the Constitutional Convention all the way to the very end of Reconstruction. We'll be talking about, of course, the Constitution. What does it say about slavery? How does it define it? And then going through the Civil War and then how that sets up our three Reconstruction amendments. So our 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. So of course, we'll be going through all of that. And of course, just like Madison said, we do have some key figures that we'll be talking about as well that use their voice and their agency to, of course, fight for the abolition of slavery. So without further ado, let's enter the exhibit. So this exhibit, like I said, it starts in 1787. And so that is the year that the Constitutional Convention met here in Philadelphia at Independence Hall. So if you've ever been to Philadelphia and you know where Independence Hall is, you know that it's literally right across, well, not necessarily the street, but kind of across the way from the National Constitution Center. So you can actually see the building from where you'd be standing if you did visit the NCC. So while there, of course, different delegates from different states, they came here to Philadelphia to initially talk about amending the Articles of Confederation. And so the Articles of Confederation was the first form of government that the United States had after the American Revolution. But they quickly realized that this document was not working. A lot of people were unhappy about what it said within the document. And so as a result, they came here to Philadelphia to try to sort it out. So there was one guy named James Madison, who is considered the father of the Constitution. He was successful in sort of persuading everyone to move away from the Articles of Confederation and actually talk about a new document, which we now know as the Constitution. So within the Constitution, of course, the delegates, they talked about so many different things. They debated about so many different things as far as what does our president look like, what does our House of Representatives look like, and things like that. But a lot of the sort of issues that they were constantly divided over is the issue of slavery, or how to define the institution of slavery within the Constitution. So there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of things that the Northern delegates didn't like, a lot of things that the Southern delegates didn't like, but ultimately they agreed on three issues. So the first is the 3/5 clause. So basically that is every enslaved person within the United States is counted as 3/5 of a person. And so if you kind of need a visual of what that looks like, if you could imagine everything from sort of the waist down, that is considered 3/5 of a person, and that's what they were considered as. And then we also have the fugitive slave clause. So basically, if you are an enslaved person and you decided to emancipate or free yourself to any free territory, your enslaver could actually come to that territory and try to retrieve you. And that was perfectly legal within the Constitution for them to do that. And then we also have the issue with the Atlantic slave trade. So the Atlantic slave trade during 1787 was still legal within the United States. It was still legal to import enslaved Africans from, of course, the continent all the way here to the United States. And so what they decided to do is they prohibited anyone, or prohibited Congress in particular, not to make a decision on the Atlantic slave trade until the year of 1808. And so, of course, in that year, the United States decided to prohibit the Atlantic slave trade from existing within the United States. But that didn't really stop the domestic slave trade from happening within the United States. That really fueled the institution of slavery until we get to the year of 1865. So those three issues that I just mentioned were really the only things that they talked about when it came to slavery. But the words slave and slavery were not included within the Constitution itself. So I think that just says a lot about what the delegates were kind of thinking about during that time, and just also kind of the indecision, right, that kind of went on when they were talking about those particular conflicts. So, like I mentioned, they do have, or we do, of course, have the domestic slave trade. So the case that we have here really details the slave experience after 1787 or after 1808, right? So in this case, we have shackles from the 1830s. So if you were an enslaved person and you had to be transported anywhere, you would most likely have had to worn those shackles either around your hands or your wrists and things like that. And then we also have a bill of sale, which says Bill of Sale for Abram, which was in 1856. And so if you were to see this bill of sale in person, you would see, of course, there's the name of the person, of the enslaved person, the enslaver, so the one that purchased Abram. And then also it sometimes would detail what Abram would look like, or what that enslaved person would look like. Ultimately, it really, or that person was really reduced down to what they looked like, right, and what they could do, and not necessarily them as a human or anything about their personality. And then in the same case, we have the Underground Railroad by William Still. So we have the first edition, which came out in 1872. And so while we have the domestic slave trade going on, there was a man named William Still who was considered the father of the Underground Railroad. And so one of the things that he did was he made sure that there were different pathways and different networks for the Underground Railroad to operate. And so if you're not familiar with what the Underground Railroad is, basically it is not a railroad like a lot of people do think, but they would have utilized railroads or train cars in order to transport people that wanted to free themselves or wanted to emancipate themselves to free territory. And so William Still, he was very influential in that entire network. So making sure that the homes that people were going to were safe and secure, making sure that different landmarks, that people could recognize different landmarks, or even landscapes, or even songs, right? All of those things were included in the Underground Railroad. So within the United States slavery, of course, there were different systems that existed in the South. So for example, in a state like South Carolina, who was very big on growing rice and indigo, they had a different system than, say, Louisiana, who was really big on sugarcane. Both of those states, or both of those crops, demanded different tasks and different responsibilities. And the institution looked a little different in those particular spaces. But at the same time, of course, it was excruciating work for anyone that was doing it. And anyone who was enslaved was not immune from the abuses of the institution. But we do have a really, really amazing example of two people that use their agency and use the Constitution in order to fight for their freedom. And here we have Harriet Scott and we have Dred Scott. And if you're familiar with the Dred Scott case, these are the two people that were included in that particular case. So the name of the case, of course, is Dred Scott, which is the husband, but a lot of the case had a lot to do with Harriet Scott and their children. So Harriet Scott and Dred Scott, of course, they were married. They were both born in Missouri, which was a slave territory at the time. And so throughout their life, they would go to different places along the Mississippi River. So Mississippi, Louisiana, places like that. But at one point, their enslaver decided to lease them to another person in Minnesota, which was a free territory at the time. And so they came to Minnesota. They, of course, were there with their person, and it was time for them to come back to Missouri, right? But they said that, hey, we've been in this free territory for a while. We have children. We are considered free. And based off of the language in the Constitution, we are definitely considered free. So what they did was they, of course, took it upon themselves to petition for their right to be free and to emancipate themselves. So this was a really important case for them, of course, not only for their freedom, but for their children's freedom. During that time, if you were an enslaved woman and you had children, your children had to take the condition of what you were. So if Harriet Scott, if she could prove that she was free, then that meant that her children would be free and basically her entire legacy. But if she was proven to still be enslaved, then that would determine the condition of her children, right? So this was a really big deal, really monumental deal for their entire family. So ultimately, this case took about 10 years for them to, or sort of 10 years from start to finish. So when they wrote the petition all the way to when it came to the Supreme Court. And so when it reached the Supreme Court, they basically shut it down and they denied their request. Up here, we have a quote from Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney in 1857, And basically it reads, African Americans had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And so that was really the most popular opinion during that time, right? And so we're not quite sure what happened to Harriet and Dred Scott's children or to Harriet. I believe that they went into hiding for a period of time just because, their life was threatened throughout that 10-year period, right? But again, it is a monumental decision that they both made. And in using the Constitution, and they knew that they had a standing based on that document, I think that that was very, very brave of them. And then here, like I said, the petition, we do have a reproduction of the petition for freedom that was done in 1846. And so on the document, it of course lists out their reasons as to why they should be considered free. And then at the very bottom, you can see that they signed their name, but they signed X because they didn't know how to write their names, right? So that was really the only way in which they could do that. And then similar to William Still, we do have a book here that's entitled Scenes in the Life of Harriet Tubman. So just like William Still, Harriet Tubman is known for her extraordinary work when it came to the Underground Railroad and emancipating hundreds of people throughout her career. So whether that was going back and forth to Maryland in her birthplace to emancipate her friends or her family, or when it came to her work as a spy during the Civil War for the Union, right? She was able to free hundreds of African Americans during that time. So again, different people that come from different backgrounds, but of course are using their agency in order to emancipate thousands of African Americans. So, and over on this side, we do have a ton more of artifacts, really amazing artifacts here that of course look at how different people use their voice to abolish slavery. So here, this book, we have Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is the first edition, which was published in 1852 by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. So Harriet Beecher Stowe, she was a different demographic from Harriet Tubman or William Still. She was a white woman that was born in Connecticut. And so while there, she developed a passion for writing and wanted to become a journalist in a way. And when she went to school in Ohio, she also developed a passion for the abolitionist movement. And so while there, that really started her career in writing about the abolitionist movement. And so as a result, she wrote that book basically detailing the tragedies or the stories of different enslaved African Americans in the South. She wanted to do that because she wanted to educate people in the northern states about what was really going on, especially because not a lot of people were sort of introduced or exposed to the institution of slavery at that time. And so this book was extremely monumental during that time because, like I said, it helped expose thousands of Americans to what was really going on in the southern states and to further fight for the abolition of thousands of African Americans. And then here in the same case, we do have a pen and inkwell that was used by Frederick Douglass. So similar to the folks that I just mentioned, Frederick Douglass, just like Harriet Tubman, they were born as enslaved individuals. And so later on in life, they took it upon themselves to emancipate themselves to northern territories. And from there, use their experience and them learning how to read and to write in order to educate people about the tragedies of slavery, right? So if you didn't know, Frederick Douglass, he's also the author of 3 autobiographies. So he was very keen on documenting his life and his life experiences. And so I think having this pen here does an amazing job of what he was able to do during his career and just what he enjoyed to do at the same time. So now we can really get into the Civil War. And so, of course, we can't talk about the Civil War without really getting into Abraham Lincoln. So here's a portrait of Abraham Lincoln. And so Abraham Lincoln, before he was elected president, not many people really knew about him. They didn't really know, what he, what he stood for, where he belonged and things like that. And so when he was nominated to become of course, the president during that time, elected as the president during that time, many people were shocked, right? But another shocking thing that really was the precursor to a lot of what the Civil War was about was his speech about slavery. And so here on this wall, we have a question: can a divided house stand? And so the quote here says, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." So Abraham Lincoln predicted in 1858 that this entire country could not operate, half free or half enslaved. And so those particular comments didn't really sound too great to the southern states of America. And so as a result, you had a lot of southern states that decided to secede from the Union or basically leave the United States, right? They felt as though those particular comments were a threat to their entire existence, to their entire economic and political well-being. And so on this wall here, we have an example of what different states said in their response to that particular speech that was made by Abraham Lincoln. So on the top here, we have Mississippi's Declaration of Secession, which was in 1861, which basically outlines why they are seceding, right? And they list slavery as being one of those reasons, right? A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. And South Carolina said something similar within their own secession document as well. They basically said that if you were to take slavery away from our state, we would be pretty much desolate, right? And so they felt so strongly about this institution that they were willing to leave the United States in order to preserve what they had. And so as a result of that, and because they, of course, felt threatened, what the Confederacy, or the newly formed Confederacy, decided to do was they decided to fire upon Fort Sumter on April 12th, 1861. So that basically sparked the Civil War, right? So it was in Charleston, South Carolina, and that gets into, of course, what the Civil War was about and what Abraham Lincoln decided to do as a result of this attack. So here in the gallery, we do have the Emancipation Proclamation. This is not the original document. This is actually a document that was signed by Abraham Lincoln himself, but it was a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. He signed it for a fundraiser that was going on right here in Philadelphia. He actually signed it here in Philadelphia as well. But what the Emancipation Proclamation did was, a lot of people think that it did initially free all of the enslaved in the Southern territories. But what's really interesting about it is that it's broken up into different pieces, and you can really dissect the meaning of the document. So up here is basically Abraham Lincoln saying that these are the guidelines that the Southern states have to follow, right? And they have to do it by this particular date, right? And so the bottom part is basically him saying that because they did not abide by his rules of freeing all of the enslaved in the Southern states, this is basically what he is going to do, right? So what it outlines is he has the different states that are held by the Confederacy, right? And basically saying that he will move into those territories and he will basically emancipate the enslaved in those territories as well. But there's also some parts in here where it doesn't emancipate all of the enslaved in Southern states. So we have different counties in places like present-day West Virginia and Virginia that basically say, or that are excluded from this particular order. And then at the very bottom, we get into him actually saying that anybody who decides to emancipate themselves and go to a Union camp or a Union regiment, they are able to find work and they are able to collect wages based on the work that they do in those particular camps. And so that was really an incentive for a lot of African American families to then emancipate themselves and run towards Union camps. And in a way, it was also, of course, a war tactic, and that if the Southern states decided, or if the Southern states had to lose all of their forced labor, then that is basically taking away, of course, resources from them, right? And so, but I think all in all, this was a perfect opportunity for African Americans to use their agency to sort of better their lives, right? So because of that, we have a huge uptick in African Americans that are, of course, moving to the Northern territories or leaving the Southern states, moving to Northern territories to help fight for the Union. And so I think this case that we have here does an amazing job in detailing what the war experience was like for formerly enslaved African American men, women, and of course, children. And so up here we have things like there was a past carried by Frederick Douglass to recruit Black troops. So again, him using his agency and of course his experience in order to continue to emancipate formerly enslaved African Americans. And then up here we have a training manual for US colored troops, which was published in 1863. So a lot of times, while a lot of the manuals, they were virtually the same for white soldiers, there were a lot of things that continued to be segregated or designated for African American soldiers. And then, of course, we also have people like Thomas Morris Chester, who served as the only Black war correspondent for a major daily newspaper. So kind of getting a different sense of the war through a different lens, right? I think that's incredibly amazing. And then people like William H. Carney, who received the Medal of Honor for his heroism during the assault on Fort Wagner, which is largely or all the way credited to the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry, which was the first African-American infantry to be formed in the United States. And so it was really monumental during that time because, like I said, at the Battle of Fort Wagner, they were very instrumental, very brave in securing that win for the Union Army. And so a lot of people, they were didn't really have a lot of confidence in African American men when it came to, or even women, when it came to the war effort. But I think when we talk about the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, all of that is sort of goes out of the window. They proved to be extremely helpful within that conflict. And then also at the very same time, we have a lot of different activists that are coming from northern territories to southern states like South Carolina in order to help African Americans learn how to read and learn how to write. So this diary here that we have at the museum is Laura M. Town's diary. So Laura M. Town, she was a Pennsylvania abolitionist that traveled to South Carolina as a relief worker in 1862. So she was using her medical training. She provided care and distributed supplies. So while she was there, she also had the opportunity to educate a lot of the African American or newly freed African American families, helping them learn how to read and learn how to write, and to, of course, use their skills and be able to make sure that their skills are something that they could do outside of the or after the Civil War. So we kind of come out of the Civil War to the Reconstruction era. And so that period spans from 1865 all the way to 1877. And so what this period looks at is, of course, a renewed sort of passion or optimism amongst African Americans, right? During this time, we have the introduction of three amendments. So we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. So these amendments basically expand the Constitution in order to establish voting rights and citizenship and liberty, right? So this was really a monumental time for education and establishing new skills in order to sort of reacclimate within society. But of course, that didn't come with, or that did come with its own set of troubles and conflicts along the way. So, of course, we're after the Civil War. The Civil War is done. We get to our first amendment, which is the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment basically abolishes slavery. And so there was kind of a little bit of conflict when it came to this particular amendment, and that a lot of the Southern delegates or lawmakers that came to DC, they were basically, or their voices weren't necessarily heard just because, of what had happened, right? So the United States didn't want anyone who was a part of the Confederacy to really have a lot of power during this time. And so as a result, we are able to pass and amend and ratify the 13th Amendment. So we have the 13th Amendment passed and ratified by the states. And then we have, of course, President Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And so his assassination was basically a really, really big blow to, of course, his efforts in the Civil War, but also to Reconstruction, right? Or to the Freedmen's Bureau and what they were trying to do within the Southern states. And so this case here really details what his assassination kind of looked like, or kind of painting the scene of what that looked like when he was assassinated. And so up here we have a wanted poster for the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination. And then on the right of that, we have Ford's Theater playbill. So basically what was playing on that night that Lincoln was assassinated. So because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, that didn't necessarily stop a lot of his efforts in making sure that the Reconstruction period, was working or going on within the United States. But there was one person, Andrew Johnson, that made it extremely difficult for that entire process to go on. So Andrew Johnson, he was, of course, the vice president, but he was moved, of course, to president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So he was the new president when it came to the Reconstruction period. So a lot of what President Johnson wanted to do was he really didn't want to promise the upward mobility of formerly enslaved African Americans within the United States. He was, in fact, really against that upward mobility and didn't really want African Americans to, pursue the things they wanted to pursue, right? He really wanted the United States to go back to the way it was prior to the Civil War beginning. And so because of that, we do have a lot of different conflicts within the United States government and things like that. Of course, there were some things that were moving along or things that helped African Americans within the United States. But again, Andrew Johnson made it extremely difficult during those times. But in this section here, a lot of African Americans, even while enslaved, always had always knew that they had they always knew of their inherent freedom, and they always knew that they had a personality. They had, things that they wanted to do, right? They had agency, they had a voice, and they knew that. And so during this time, this was the perfect opportunity for them to, of course, gain upward mobility. And so during this time, we have different people that, of course, are trying to find different family members. So family members that were either sold away from their home and trying to really reconnect with people that they've always known or maybe have grown up with. And then we also have African Americans that are going to school and building new careers. We have schools like the Hampton Institute, which is now known as Hampton University, that was really, really influential in making sure that African Americans learned different skills or had different jobs during that time. And so it really was a prosperous period for a lot of African Americans. But of course, as things went on, a lot of the Southern states, they found different loopholes, even through the 13th Amendment, that basically was used to further put down formerly enslaved African Americans. And so here in this section, we have the Black Codes. So the Black Codes were basically a list of laws that were implemented by many of the Southern states that basically outlined what African Americans were able to or not able to do. And so some examples of that were if you were, or you couldn't loiter, right? So loitering is basically you kind of, standing around somewhere. You couldn't be out in the city or the town after a certain period of the day. And you also had to have a job, right? So if you were caught doing any of those three things, you could be arrested. So if you could imagine, if you were a formerly enslaved person in the Southern states, how hard it might be to find a job. And so if you don't have a job, you could be thrown into prison, right? And so this is what the Black Codes did. It was basically using that loophole in order to have a huge amount of African Americans thrown into prison, thus creating the institution of slavery all over again, even after the Civil War. So, of course, the United States government is catching on to many of the things that Southern states are doing in order to further immobilize African Americans in the South. And so because of that, we get the 14th Amendment, which establishes citizenship, liberty, and equality. And so what this does is that it opens up opportunities for African Americans to become married, right? To have an actual marriage certificate. Or if they wanted to get an education, it opens up the doors for a lot of different historically Black colleges and universities to open and to actually educate this large group of people, right? And then as a result, we also get a lot of, or sort of the recognition of certain holidays. So we have Juneteenth. Juneteenth kind of arises as a result of all of these different struggles, but all of these different, people that had hope in their journey within the United States. So again, this exhibit has a ton of artifacts and primary sources, documents that really detail the African American experience after the Civil War. And so in this case here, just like I mentioned in the beginning of the 14th Amendment, we have these artifacts that touch on education, that touch on marriage, and learning how to read and how to write. And so this book here, it's entitled Candlelightin' Time with Poetry by Paul Laurence Dunbar, which was published in 1901. So the book features photographs taken by students at Hampton Institute, which again is now Hampton University, which was founded in 1868. And so the school was founded, to help people with, whether it was bricklaying, they had laundry classes and things like that. But also, I think it's really, really fascinating that they also allowed the time for their students to learn how to take pictures, right? Or to write poetry and things like that. And then here we have a marriage license from 1870. And so marriage amongst African Americans, even during slavery, was not new, but now with the 14th Amendment, they are recognized under the law, right? Whereas before, if you wanted to get married, you would have to ask your enslaver. But a lot of times, even that wasn't enough, or your marriage wasn't necessarily recognized. So this was super duper major within the community during that time. So now we have one more thing we have to kind of get through, one more hurdle we have to get over. And so that is voting rights, right? So here we have the 15th Amendment, which basically guarantees voting rights for any person in the United States. But I want to backtrack, not any person in the United States. Basically, it opens up voting rights for African American men, right? So anyone or any man that was formerly enslaved or in bondage, they can now vote within the United States. So, of course, this was huge. This was very monumental within United States history, because now you have a huge population of people that can now use their voice and use their right in order to cast their ballot. And so, of course, you have a lot of different people, especially some from the suffrage movement, that are looking at the 15th Amendment and using that as a tool in order to advance their own goals when it came to extending voting rights for women, right? And then also you have Black women that were very instrumental in that sort of movement as well. And then as a result of the 15th Amendment, we have a plethora of African American men that were elected in their particular offices. So whether it was Hiram Rhodes Revels, who took his seat as America's first Black senator on February 25th, 1870. And then we have Robert Smalls, who was elected to 2 positions in South Carolina and served 5 terms in the US House. And then also I thought that this is really cool, Ebenezer Don Carlos Bassett. He was the first African American to serve as a U.S. diplomat. He was appointed as the minister to Haiti in 1869. So that really gives you an idea of the different positions that African American men were able to hold as a result of the 15th Amendment, and really all of the amendments that we talked about today, right? And then it also goes to show that, how many of these people were elected, or how successful were they, because they have this large population of people that are now able to vote, right? So we also have, again, a plethora of different artifacts. Here in this case, it goes into the experience of the voter, or the African-American voter, during the Reconstruction era. So we have things like the ballot box from 1867. We have a poll tax receipt from 1923. And then we also have here a U.S. House vote tally on the Enforcement Act in 1870. And I think it's really, really cool that we can see that Hiram Rhodes Revels, his vote is actually counted on this particular paper as well, or this document. And so we've talked a lot about, of course, citizenship, equality, voting rights within the Southern states. But I also do want to mention that all of these conflicts that were going on in the Southern states, they were also pretty prevalent within Northern territories as well. So this man here, Octavius V. Cato, he was a teacher and activist who organized Black voters in Philadelphia. And so during a racially polarized election in 1871, many Black Philadelphians went to the polls before daybreak to avoid violent confrontations. But as a result, white mobs, they tried to intimidate them by, of course, using violence or threatening violence amongst the Black voters. And as a result, Octavius V. Cato, he lost his life along with 9 other African Americans in Philadelphia trying to vote, right? So again, we see there's a lot of different conflict that is in the Southern states, but I don't want you to forget that a lot of these different conflicts that African Americans had to endure as a whole, they were not absent in Northern territories as well. And so, of course, this is just one example of someone that tried to do something good for voting rights, and basically was considered or made a martyr for that particular case. So we have voting rights. And just like how we talked about the Black codes, here in this section, we have the backlash, right? So a lot of what's going on towards the end of Reconstruction is basically a culmination of all of the different tactics that Southern states are making when it comes to denying African Americans their citizenship, or denying African Americans equality within the United States. And so these 2 artifacts that we see here are different ways in which white Americans continue to do that. So whether it was joining organizations like the White League, or a petition from Black residents of Frankfort, Kentucky, who are outlining the violence that organizations like the Ku Klux Klan is enacting on their community, right? So they are really screaming for someone to help them out, right? But of course, at the very end of Reconstruction, we do know that that was sparked based on the removal of US federal troops from Southern territories, meaning that Southern territories and politicians and people, they were able to pretty much do exactly what they wanted to do, right? They wanted to go back to the system or the institution of slavery. They wanted to go back to a particular system that worked for them before the Civil War. And so at the very end of Reconstruction, that's basically what happens. So, of course, even though the end of Reconstruction doesn't really end on a good note when it comes to African Americans. We still have African Americans throughout that entire time period that, of course, are using their voice, using the Constitution in order to sue for their freedom, right? Or use the courts in order to make sure that they are upholding what is in the Constitution. And so on this wall here, you see, or you can see different cases that come out of or come after the Reconstruction era that detail, of course, voting rights, right? Or being able to integrate certain public spaces. Or if it comes to wanting to marry who you'd like to marry, or education and things like that. So even though, like I said, this period is sort of very dark within the United States or for the United States, you still have brave people that are using the Constitution to do what's right within the United States. So I know that that was a ton of information, a ton of things to think about. But this is probably one of my favorite exhibits here in the museum. So I am so super duper grateful to have had the opportunity to bring you guys through the space. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ari. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.